If you want to be part of God's family, simple faith, simple trust in God is the only thing that's necessary. Hi, welcome to our channel here at Mundelein Church in the Nazarene, and welcome to our series, The First Book. It is an examination of the book of Galatians. And I know from the previous episodes that you know we're calling it the first book because this is the first book chronologically to be written in the New Testament. And it deals with the very first big issue that the church faced. Chapter 1, the previous two episodes, we laid the groundwork to what this issue was really about. As we ended chapter 1, we have Paul's reference defending of himself as an apostle, defending his message, that he received it from God, that he was not under the control of some group that was trying to undermine the church or undermine Judaism. And we kind of ended with the idea that we have Paul representing one expression of the church, James, Jesus' brother, representing another wing of the church, and somewhere in between is Peter. Now, Peter's role will come more into focus as we move through. And today we want to tackle chapter 2, verses 1 through 11, and then 1 through 10, and then next week it'll really get interesting. But I think there's enough there this week. So, we shared out of chapter 1 last week that Paul had his experience, waited 3 years, went to Jerusalem, met with Peter, and he said himself met with James. And then chapter 2 starts off this way. 14 years later, I went up again to Jerusalem, this time with Barnabas, and I took Titus as well. I went in response to a revelation and set before them the gospel that I preach among the Gentiles. Now, the message that he preaches among the Gentiles is simply this. It comes from Genesis 15. Abraham believed God and it was credited to him as righteousness. If you want to be part of God's family, simple faith, simple trust in God is the only thing that's necessary. That was Paul's basic message. Now, there's a timeline element here we just established. So we had Paul's conversion experience. We had 3 years, and he goes to Jerusalem and meets with Peter and James. Then 14 years later. So we have basically 17 years between his conversion and what's going on right now. Now, I am fully with people like James Dunn and N.T. Wright that Galatians was written in probably 48 AD. It was written before the Jerusalem conference, which we know took place in 49. Go back 17 years and we can pretty well establish that Saul was converted in 31 AD. Maybe 30, but we have a very specific time frame. Now we have 17 years later, it's 48. And Paul has been in Antioch, proclaiming his message. And he says this, I did this privately to those who seemed to be leaders. Now, last week we had this important question about what Paul really thought of James, and whether his wording in chapter 1 was in reference to the fact that James was an apostle, or where Paul thought that James was not worthy of being deemed an apostle. I think now in chapter 2 we have another instance of Paul privately, not privately, of Paul giving a little sideways backhand to someone in the church. I did this privately to those who seemed to be leaders for fear that I was running or had run my race in vain. So I think Paul is stating there are people in the church who are recognized as leaders but really aren't, because their message isn't the same message that God gave me. And I think, again, James is very much in view here. this is tension that exists between these two very starkly different visions of what Christianity will look like moving forward. Paul moves on and says, "Yet not even Titus, who was with me, was compelled to be circumcised, even though he was a Greek." So Paul brings one of his new converts who was thoroughly a Greek. He was a Gentile, had no Jewish blood. And Paul said, they met him, and when they met one of my new converts, they did not ask for Titus to be circumcised. This was probably, end of 14 years, probably a year earlier than from when this was written. And Paul's going, wait a minute. They met Titus. They knew the kind of people that I was bringing to the church, and they didn't ask that he become circumcised. Now, this is where I have to stop and do a little commercial. So, when we talk about circumcision today, we're talking about the medical procedure that removes the foreskin of a male, usually right after birth. And while that is also what the Jewish people were referring to, they weren't referring to the medical procedure, they were referring to the religious practice that carried meaning. And the meaning was, who are God's people? God's people are the Jews. Well, how could you tell? They're circumcised. Well, of course, the men. So, this is a very important, distinct physical trait. It's like an identity badge. It's a marker of who God's people were. And he says, wait, this whole matter, whatever caused this book to be written, this matter arose because some false brothers had infiltrated our ranks to spy on the freedom we have in Christ and to make us slaves. Now, so what matter arose? The fact that the previous phrase was about circumcision means that whatever this matter was, it centered somehow on this practice of circumcision. And it says certain brothers infiltrated. The word here used means someone launched a conspiracy. It wasn't honestly done. There was subterfuge, and they came under false pretenses and then reported back. And so Paul is saying whoever was at the source of this report was doing so untruthfully, and their motives should be questioned. So Paul wants to make this about freedom that they have in Christ. This word freedom is used more in Galatians than any other book. It's used a number of times. Because freedom was how the Greeks viewed themselves. They had freedom. And so Paul is upholding this principle. And if you submit to what the Jews are requiring you to do, you have lost the very freedom that you value. That is what's at stake. So Paul then goes on, and he has another subtle dig at his opponents. As for those who seemed to be important. Well, who are those? Well, I think it's the same people who were in verse 2 who only seemed to be leaders. And I think the arrows for me are pointing right back to James. Paul is pointing to the head of the people who are undermining his ministry. And he's going, they look to be leaders, but he's really not a leader. You think he's important, he's really not important. You think he's an apostle, I'm telling you he's not an apostle. And I want you to know that God does not judge by external appearance. This is another reference back to circumcision. That God does not judge by what you see on the outside. Who are God's people? Well, they're those who are marked. Those who are circumcised. Paul is beginning to change that basic premise. God's people are not those who just have foreskins cut off or who are avoiding pork, but God's people are those who exercise simple faith. In fact, he says this, on the contrary, they saw that I had been entrusted with the task of preaching the gospel to the Gentiles, just as Peter had been given the task of preaching the gospel to the Jews. For God, who was at work in the ministry of Peter as an apostle to the Jews, was also at work in my ministry as apostle to the Gentiles. So Paul right away is he's both upholding the status of Peter. He goes, no, I recognize the value of Peter. He's trying to reach the Jews. I'm trying to reach the Gentiles. So in a very subtle way, Paul says, look, value Peter, but I'm putting myself at the same level. So Paul has not only defended his message and defended his status, he's now claimed that his status is equal to Peter. I want you to understand that that claim would have been met with some resistance in the first century. They would have been upset by that. Who are you to claim equal status with Peter? Peter was one of the disciples. Peter was there. You weren't there. This is an important thing for Paul to do. And then he says, right after that, James, Peter, and John, those who are reputed to be pillars. This is, again, a little subtle dig. I don't think it's a dig at Peter. He's just upheld Peter in the previous verse. But every time we're talking about James, it's those who seem to be important, those who seem to be leaders, those who are just reputed to be pillars. So Paul is undermining some of the people who are behind those who are undermining him. And he says, when they met me and Barnabas, they gave us the right hand of fellowship when they recognized the grace given to me. And then Paul's looking at these people in Galatia, and he's saying this. And they agreed, all of us agreed, that we should go to the Gentiles and they should go to the Jews. All that they asked, this is verse 10, was that we should continue to remember the poor. The very thing that we were eager to do. When we get to some of Paul's other letters like Philippians, we know that in 2 Corinthians, Paul was pushing and taking offerings to remember the believers who are struggling. Often those are the Jewish believers in Jerusalem because they were poorer than some of the Greeks around the empire. So Paul says, look, I've done that. And so you get to the end of this section, the first opening section of chapter 2. Wait a minute. Peter, James, John, they were all there. Barnabas and I, we were there. We were with Titus. They all agreed. They extended us their right hand that we should preach to the Gentiles. And yet, from that meeting just a year before to the writing of this book of Galatians, something has blown up. What possibly could have blown up? I thought they were all agreed. Either Paul is lying or he's extraordinarily mistaken about some things. That's what we might think. Let me tell you something else. The something else is this. I do literally think that Paul and Barnabas and Peter and James were all on the same page. You go to the Gentiles, we'll go to the Jews, and we're going to reach people. And then Paul and Barnabas did exactly that. They're in Antioch. They have tremendous success. They start churches filled with Gentiles. But what I think that James and Peter and John were expecting would be for Paul then to require that these new believers go through the things the Jews had to go through. That he would make these believers become circumcised. That he would make these believers avoid pork. That he would make these believers observe the Jewish feasts. I think they just assumed that. And then Peter, and then when Paul went to these Gentiles and actually won them to the church and then didn't require that, I think Peter and James were not expecting that. And hadn't thought about that issue. Were just assumed that Paul would make them become Jews. And Paul didn't. He said, no, I'm to minister to the Gentiles. The Gentiles are going to come to God as Gentiles. The Jews, you can keep coming to God as Jews. That was the issue now that they're facing. And the issue that caused the blow up in Galatians. Next week, we're going to talk about the blow-up, because Paul writes about it very specifically. Thanks for joining us. I hope you're following along our study of Galatians, and we take a decidedly historical approach. Because if you don't, then I think the Bible loses its meaning. We have to know what's going on in the background. And so we've kind of narrowed it down a little bit more this week. We have James, John, and Peter, and you have Paul on the other side, except when we get to this next section of chapter 2, Peter has joined Paul in Galatians, and now is doing work with Paul and seeing what Paul is up to, and that gives rise to the big conflict next week. Hey, like our channel. We love it. Subscribe to us so you know when the next thing's coming out. And please comment. We'd love to answer your question or respond to your challenge. But thank you for being a part. We look forward to seeing you back here next week.